There were 3 points that I was trying to ask you to remember. Firstly, this is a really, really complex problem that has built up over many years. Secondly, there are reasons to be optimistic currently that there's a great deal of effort trying to resolve and address the housing problem, but it won't be quick. And thirdly, I do think there are opportunities for the faith-based sector and particularly for national faith-based organisations. So amongst all the debates on this, some things are uncontestable. The evidence is overwhelming. Home ownership is declining for all age groups, and that is including the over 75s, and private rental is growing. So people can only have 3 kinds of tenure. They can own their own house with a mortgage, they can be in private rental, or they're in non-market social housing. So the only place for people to go mostly is in the private rental market. Social housing, which we used to define as public housing but now includes community housing providers like the Salvation Army, is the only non-market item that has been growing over the last 10 years. We also know that household debt is rising and has been significantly over the last 15 years. And the percentage of homeowners in retirement with significant debt is rising significantly. And this becomes very important for people when we think about home ownership and the pension being the anchors of a secure old age. The time taken to save for a deposit is now reaching monstrous terms, and not acceptable in my view that we say the bank of mum and dad is the means to do this, partly because the mums and dads in many cases don't have it, and partly because those kids shouldn't depend upon it. There are then more controversial items. There are people who would say that the only issue is about undersupply, and that is an issue. The government has set a target of building 1.2 million dwellings in total over the next 5 years, which is 240,000 a year. Over the last 5 years, we've barely managed 170,000. So we're talking a 25–30% increase in total dwelling starts. But of course, it's not simply about supply. And I'll go through this in a moment to illustrate the other factors at play. There's obviously evidence of excess demand. What's less clear is where that's coming from. And planners and regulatory systems everywhere get bad press. So planning is holding up what people should be doing. They're all of different subsidies, particularly demand-side deposit assistance and the like, and controversially the role of tax, particularly capital gains tax concessions and negative gearing. So if we can pause for a moment and look at on the demand side, the kind of typical issues. For a long time, we had thought that the reason why home ownership rates amongst young people, the critical age cohort is 25 to 34, was declining was because women were delaying the timing of their first child, or household formation was being delayed for a variety of reasons. Labour market mobility was causing people to move more often. In fact, it was none of those things. It was about affordability. But population and immigration and migration, interstate migration, become incredibly important. And during the pandemic, our immigration numbers almost completely halted for a variety of reasons you would all know. It's now being cranked up very quickly. So in December last year, the briefing from the Commonwealth Treasury predicted that our immigration programme for 2023 would be 180,000 people. By June, that had increased to 400,000 people, and by the end of the year, it's likely to be well in advance of that. And so the obvious point is that's the biggest increase in the net population increase in Australia. So it's a simple formula that's our fertility rates less outward migration plus immigration. We've also seen, of course, significant changes in housing preferences during the pandemic. My friend and colleague Jed Donahue from Tasmania was saying before, the pandemic changed everybody's behaviour, and you can now do a large number of jobs from anywhere, which means you can also move anywhere. So a whole lot of green and coastal settings found increased demand that they hadn't seen for a generation. There are big issues to do with income and wealth distributions, and Minister Lee went through some of those before. The availability and cost of finance, we've obviously seen a 50% increase in interest rates now over a 3-year period. And lastly, the influence of taxation, both in terms of tax levied and in tax concessions given. So these are amongst the critical factors on the demand side. On the supply side, where everybody is most focused at the moment, we obviously have very big issues around the construction sector. The capability of the sector, the costs associated with building, the access to the labour market and skills and the materials. It is the case that in the last 3 years, construction costs have gone up almost 40% in a 3-year period. It's also the case that commercial finance, which sits above mortgage rates, has also gone up faster than residential interest rates. In terms of people investing in housing, notwithstanding the substantial increase in values, the opportunity cost of being in other segments of the economy, the share market, commercial, industrial property, have seen people often put money into other places. In terms of the risk profile around housing, there's obviously times where people see a risk because prices have gone up exponentially, this can't hold, that causes people to withdraw from the market. And probably the single biggest issue in terms of supply is around the provision of service land. So it's not only land availability, it's land which has the necessary services, both physical and social. And in all of this, the last issue is around regulation and the approval mechanisms, whether it be planning or land division or whatever. This is a very simple graph I made up a long time ago, trying to understand what governments could do. So on the top box, people get on with their life, make their own choices, and housing markets operate. If governments want to intervene, they essentially intervene in 3 areas. Firstly, they regulate markets. So building schemes regulate the built environment, set up standards, the use of land. We also regulate tenures, so things like residential tenancies agreements or legislation in each of the states. But in terms of direct outcomes, the big economic debate in housing over the last 30 years has been between supply-side interventions and demand interventions. Supply-side being those things that directly produce land and dwellings. Demand are those things which put money in people's pockets and allow them to make choices. And for those of us interested in non-market housing, social and affordable housing, the big shift from the Henderson inquiry since the 1980s has been towards demand-side interventions relying upon welfare payments, CRA and the like, as a way from government actually producing supply of stock. So our supply of public and social housing in Australia is less than 5%. It's amongst the lowest in the Western world. But these philosophical debates between demand and supply-side interventions colour everything that you hear. In Australia, it's a complex place to work, and I won't go through this in huge detail. But this is a bit like Closing the Gap or NDIS, or we have these meta ambitions in Australia, and they cover everything. So in Australia, we've got the Treasurer, the Social Services Minister, the Finance Minister, the Housing Minister, a suite of agencies that have been created, as well as a whole lot of other agencies like immigration and infrastructure. The immigration system itself, of course, is complex and is currently going through a review, but that simple number on the restoration acceleration of immigration is likely to be the biggest single influence in housing prices over the next 2 or 3 years. And then these arrangements are replicated at the state level with state treasuries and development authorities, planning commissions, and the like. So if we can go into just a little bit more detail on what's happening right now. There's obviously been a rebound in immigration, but it's happening much faster than anybody expected. It is not at all impossible that we'll see immigration next year of 500,000 people. So we are seeing a very large increase. Now, the reasons for that are fundamentally that Australia can't generate the skills that it requires to run the economy. The economy has depended upon immigration for most of the post-war period. We are now making up for the loss of population that was endured during the COVID period. We've got higher household incomes because for the first time in about a decade, net wages are going up slightly. There are shifting preferences, obviously, between rural, urban, and green and sea change areas. And we are also seeing much higher household formation rates. Drawn up, household formation rates, that is the fundamental demand driver. Now, importantly, for cities like Melbourne or Sydney, the immigration figure will have very immediate and specific and locational impacts on housing markets. So about a third of migrants will be students, and they'll want to be in the central cities of capital cities. So you're going to see a very big number of people in the private rental market in the central cities, and conversely, price escalations for everybody else. Housing supply has been very slow to respond for a whole range of reasons. There's demand pressures that people couldn't keep up with. The spare capacity that's usually in the pipeline, we usually have 15, 20% of spare capacity where builders and contractors can tool up to do more. All that's exhausted. But the biggest single impact was the influence of home builder. Home builder was put in place as an untapped federal subsidy that bridged the gap between people who were marginally excluded from making the deposits for first home purchases, and essentially sucked forward between 5 and 8 years of supply amongst that group. The Reserve Bank concludes that the inflation problem we now have is between 35% and 40% due to this program in itself. And of course, during this time, we've seen large numbers of builders go broke because most of these contracts were written in fixed prices, and then we went through a period where house prices went up between 30 and 40% over 3 years. So that in itself has been major in its impact. We've got input shortages, obviously the international situation in Ukraine, and more recently, the international instability has seen the import of materials make it very difficult both to access and to pay for them. The banks have closed down in terms of credit conditions, and in terms of access to labour, important to note that unemployment as of this month is at a 50-year low. For those people in the private rental market, we're now at a record level of 1.1%, which is essentially no vacancies. And only a year ago, that was 3.3% nationally. Now, what happens when these changes occur is investors oscillate in and out of the market. So people are now returning to the market, potentially because they see the rise in housing prices fueled by large numbers of migrants contributing to household formation. The issue with that is that the private rental market is not a stable place for people to be housed. Two things. In most jurisdictions, private rental contracts are written for a 12-month period, and we know that 52% of private renters expect or intend that they'll be moving within 12 months. Now, if you're a household with children at schools. That means you're constantly trying to imagine where your kids are going to school and where your support services are going to come from. Secondly, because the private rental market is made up of what are termed mum and dad investors, and we shouldn't use those terms really. It's made up of a very large number of people with 1 or 2 investment properties and a small number of people with a very large number of properties. So I keep meeting people with 40, 50 and 60 investment properties, and I'll leave it for you to judge what their motivations are in doing that, but it's clearly about the accumulation of value through holding properties over time. In the Housing Supply Council, the first report that was commissioned by federal and state treasurers was to look into what's termed the build-to-rent investment class in Australia. In other countries, in Europe, in the States and elsewhere, the private rental market is made up also of institutional investors. And by that we mean people who may be in superannuation funds, in equity firms, but move capital around. The significant thing about build-to-rent is it holds out the prospect of stable occupation. These people aren't motivated by uplifting capital gains over time. What the investment is required to deliver a cash return over the life of the building, which would be 50 or 60 years. So people can more easily live in these places for large periods of time. And secondly, because of that, and because of the competition, rents are more stable and predictable. So family accommodation in the States, housing trusts in Germany and some of the Scandinavian countries, there is significant potential for this to occur in Australia. It's already happening in Brisbane and Sydney and in Melbourne at the top end of the market, but these are 2-bedroom units renting for $1,000 and $1,200 a week. What we worked upon in our report is how do we get that level of institutional investment down to the affordable and social ends of the market, and I'll come back to that. In terms of housing affordability, obviously interest rates have a big impact on owners, and we essentially calculate mortgage payments as a percentage of household income. Now, home ownership rates are now at 67% and going down. Most importantly, they're going down fastest amongst young people, 25 to 34 and 35 to 44. In New South Wales, the amount of time for a first home buyer to save for a deposit is now 12.3 years. In Melbourne, it's 10.2 years. If we look at the homes that are able to be purchased by people on median incomes, it was 50% in the 1990s, 35% 4 years ago, and is now 13%. You can't buy a house if you're on an ordinary household income. And 7% of home sales are now defined statistically as affordable. So the horse has bolted away. We have a deep-seated, large structural problem. I don't need to reiterate these points about the rental market. Rents are up and vacancies are down because there's nowhere for people to go. This has huge distribution impact. So the way economists think about this is to look at income distribution across a spectrum that's divided into 5. So there's 5 quintiles. The lowest income quintile who are buying are now paying 60% of household income and mortgage costs, and this will get worse as of yesterday. Pre-pandemic, the 7% of lowest quintile were purchasing. It's now down to 1%. Rentals in this quintile pay 33% of their household income and costs. The highest quintile pays 14%. Now, importantly, that gives a kind of general figure, but it is not uncommon to find people paying 50 and 60% of household income, in housing costs. And I think the point that Minister Lee was making this morning was very much that we need to pause and think about what kind of world we're creating here. I was reading the Financial Review a few weeks ago, and I looked at what caught my eye was a house in Tasmania was being sold for $14 million. And I was thinking, in Hobart, that's ridiculous. How could that be? It was 12 kilometers from Hobart, and it was being sold for $14 million. And I turned the page, and in Bayside, down here in Brighton, there was a house for sale for $43 million. So we're now finding ourselves in a circumstance where these enormous changes in wealth distribution are being fueled by the housing market. And the ability for young people to assemble assets, pay them off over time, provide stability for themselves and their families is being seriously questioned. I don't need to tell anyone in this room that who are the most vulnerable groups. Single parents, single older women, unemployed, people with disability, people on welfare income support payments. Now, people like to talk about single older women because it's the thing that so disturbs them. In my previous role, I ran a national social housing provider. And when we started to notice the number of single older women fronting our organization, we were a bit perplexed to find out what was behind this. And there were 4 factors. Firstly, the highest incidence of marriage breakdown is now happening in 50s and 60s. So one household that owned a house breaks apart. You now have 2 households in the private rental market frequently. For the woman who's had a period of instability in her employment conditions, it means that her personal savings will be low, but absolutely her superannuation will be much, much lower than anybody else. Typically, these people are find themselves where they're living with children, living with friends, and are devastated by the circumstances they find themselves, because they're going into their 60s and 70s with fixed incomes, but with their major expense them having no control of because rents are rising so quickly. So these are, they're not ordinary women, they're just the women you'll find up and down the street. There'll be people who were teaching at your local school, people you'd see at your church on Sunday. And we can't categorize these people anymore in some marginalized way. Look, I won't go into this, but in terms of the complexity of housing policy at the present time, there's a range of ministries and a range of institutions. I won't go through, but it is a very complex environment. Very quickly, though, Julie, I just wanted to stress some of the things that are underway. The government has set aside $10 billion in a Housing Australia Future Fund, which Andrew Lee talked about earlier. The intention of this is that the fund is set aside and the income generated from the fund then provides a steady income source to fund new housing starts, and I'll talk about how that works. In the 30th of June this year, faced with a larger than expected budget surplus, the government allocated $2 billion to the states and territories in a social housing accelerator payment that was paid on the 30th of June. And there's also $1.7 billion paid annually through the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement. Now, in terms of this, the government have set a national target of 1.2 million dwellings over the next, 24 to 29. The $3 million for the for new homes bonus. That's the shared equity payment that the government talked about before. There's some extra funds available for housing support programs. Through the accord with the states, there's been an agreed program of planning reform and financial incentives for the states to provide housing supply more quickly. And also there's a negotiation over a better deal for renters, and it includes things like longer terms, ability to have pets, ability to hang pictures on the walls, and so on. In addition, the Commonwealth Rent Assistance has gone up 15% after hardly any change for a number of years. There's a home guarantee scheme and help to buy for people trying to get into home ownership. And then for Housing Australia, previously called NIFIC, 2 things. There's an extra $1 billion for grants to make housing projects work. And also, what this organization essentially does is gather up the borrowings of not-for-profits and access the bond market directly. So there's an additional $2 billion allocated for debt. I wanted to speak just quickly about the Housing Affordability Fund, because I think it's enormously important, and it has a lofty ambition to try and alter the private rental market over time, but also especially to get new forms of investment into the sector. So basically, there's $10 billion set aside. There's 30,000 new homes to be built. And of course, that's dependent on construction costs and interest rates. And the simple point is that in order for this to work, there has to be new capital brought in to square this off. In addition, there's 10,000 dwellings being built through the Housing Accord. But importantly, it's this fund that is drawing superannuation funds and equity funds into the provision of social and affordable housing for the first time. So why is this new? My friend Jed and I were talking in the break about how the only horizon we ever had was the next year. The sector in Australia has never had the ability to have a 5 or 10-year horizon in which you could build institutions, build up capability. This will have, in its initial term, a 5-year view. The financing is complex. It will be a combination of debt, equity via institutional investors and superannuation funds, and grants. And the government, as I said, has allocated an additional $1 billion for grant payments. The equity payment, in order to satisfy institutional investors, is termed an availability payment over 25 years. And the intention is that investors will need to aggregate capital, because superannuation funds are very large, and from our investigations, we really need thresholds of something like $50 to $150 million in minimum access. So over 5 years, there's a minimum of $500 million per year to be committed, and during that 5 years, 25 years of commitment alongside the debt period will be made. So this is a very big and bold experiment to see whether we can fund this differently. The community housing sector, of which the Salvation Army is part, is the only growth in non-market housing over the past decade. It's still small and disparate. There are more than 600 organisations, and obviously this is not being unkind to the enormous efforts that a small organisation puts in. The question we've got is about scale and the ability to manage risks. What we're trying to do is to find a way in which social and affordable housing is classed as economic infrastructure rather than welfare payments. And in doing so, can we build a new class of institutions to do this? Now, very quickly, the aggregation problem that I mentioned, which is the minimum thresholds of investment, also creates an opportunity for certain kinds of institutions, like the Salvation Army. And it's not my job to suggest what you should be doing. But larger organizations, including faith-based organizations with national scope, have the ability to aggregate up projects from different places and to work over time. So like yourself, like Uniting Care, like a whole range of organizations, my expectation is we're going to see a limited number of people operate substantially in this space. I want to say very quickly that as if we didn't have challenges enough in rural and urban, in regional and rural areas, the problems are much more challenging. The labour shortages are bigger, and the industry presence is smaller because they often don't have volume builders. And if we think about the problem we've got with the quality of Aboriginal housing, this becomes critical. So costs are high, yields are low, and the valuations by the bank will typically be 20% below construction costs. So we've got challenges everywhere we look. Julie, I won't go through these details, but perhaps if there's any questions, I can answer them. But provides comments of some of the ways in which this is going to work. So the points I was trying to make in my presentation, this is a complex, wicked problem. The attributions aren't simple. It will take us some time to dig ourselves out of this. A systemic problem needs a systemic solution over its multiple parts. The community housing sector could be crucial in all of this, and I certainly hope that that's the case. And I think that faith-based providers at scale have a unique opportunity that seriously warrants your attention and consideration. Thank you so much, Tom, for listening this morning.